At the time of Claremont's departure from X-Men Comics, he was the best-selling comics writer in the world, and a company man who had been staunchly loyal to Marvel Comics for decades. That they would want to get rid of him is therefore unusual, but the historical record depicts a conflict of wills and egos, and above all else, choices. Let's start with a little hindsight. Austin Gorton of the Real Gentleman of Leisure website describes the situation from the perspective of Claremont's fans as such, quote, "Much has been written about Claremont's departure, how it was handled, who was to blame. He received a raw deal, no doubt about it, pushed aside in favor of the hot new thing, which, in a delightful bit of schadenfreude, shortly thereafter pushed aside the people who booted Claremont, despite his decades of history and the level of his success, elevating an afterthought of a title into an industry juggernaut. His departure, while necessary in the eyes of the powers that be, was handled poorly, and by most accounts, unprofessionally." End quote. Yet in an interview with Tom DeFalco, editor Bob Harris provides the account of his perspective on the situation. Quote, "I felt like we had to go back to what X-Men was all about, and to me X-Men was Xavier and Scott and Jean and all the other classic characters. But Chris didn't want to do that kind of stuff anymore. He felt that he had done it already. My point was, sure, that's the X-Men. It was getting so we were speaking the same language, but we couldn't understand each other. Also, at that point I was getting whispers from the sales department, saying that the retailers were unhappy. There was a subtle pressure from that direction to do something drastic with the book. It was doing well enough, but I got these rumblings that excitement wasn't there anymore. It had the numbers still, that was Chris's point, and it was valid. His books had the best sales by far in the industry. He had made it the #1 book. Why mess with that? But on the other hand, I knew I had a great asset in Jim Lee, who also had feelings about the direction he wanted the stories to take. It was like, which way do we go?" End quote. Harris's inclination leaned toward Jim Lee, who was already in the habit of faxing directions for the need to pump up Claremont's plots, usually increasing scale and spectacle, but often with some casual misogyny, such as the idea that the Skrull villain in UXM 275 would be more imposing if it raped Deathbird and Lilandra in an attempt to impregnate them, or that Rogue should crumple to the ground an inconsolable wreck as Magneto flies away, mad with power. At this point in the run, Claremont was working more around subtlety and character consistency rather than dramatic spectacle. Claremont took his complaint to Marvel VP Michael Hobson in a letter dated April 4th, 1991, asking, quote, "Am I a creative artist in my own right or merely a pair of hands transcribing another person's vision? 2 years ago, Louise Simonson and I accounted between us for 40% of Marvel's direct sales. I would wager that percentage held true last year as well. Yet she has gone in anger and bitterness, and I feel that I'm a small step away from being booted after her. To be honest, this is a letter I never conceived of writing, a situation I never thought would have to be addressed. I find myself looking at the body of work that encompasses nearly half my life that I am very proud of, and wondering why I bothered. I look at a company that I have loyally served for longer than most of the people currently working there, and again wonder why I bothered." End quote. From there, correspondence between Claremont and Harris continued to get more contentious, with Harris noting that, quote, "None of this is meant to be taken as an insult or punishment, Chris," end quote, whilst informing Claremont that his stories were being altered. Claremont responds, quote, "I am in receipt of your fax of 9th April, and I appreciate your frankness. I further appreciate the fact that, although you were given full plots for both the issues involved, you made not the slightest effort to work with me as the writer on the book to bring them to a point where they would prove acceptable to you, but chose instead to hand them over to Jim and Wills to handle any and all required modifications." End quote. By April 23rd, Claremont again petitioned Michael Hobson to intervene, noting, quote, "The plain fact of the matter is that my editor has intentionally and deliberately acted to defraud me. This is not the basis for any sort of positive working relationship. Indeed, in mainstream prose publishing houses, and this I know from personal experience, it is grounds for immediate dismissal for the employee editor responsible. This is intolerable. If something is not done to set things right and done quickly, then I see no hopes whatsoever for a positive resolution." End quote. Harris's resolution was to give the reins to Jim Lee, while offering Claremont the opportunity to continue scripting the series. Lee would provide the plots, the core of the narrative storytelling. Claremont would fill in the dialogue. Claremont was wounded and insulted by this arrangement, but nonetheless acquiesced to fill in the text and thought bubbles of someone else's stories with the characters he'd cultivated. Eventually, though, the situation proved untenable. Claremont departed, negotiating to write one final story arc as his severance package, the first issue of which would go on to become the best-selling single-issue comic of all time, a record that stands today. In hindsight, Claremont describes this time in his life as such, quote, "There was just all this butting of heads, and we all got boxed into corners. Bob and Jim wanted to do what they wanted to do, and the feeling was I could not or would not go along, and they were going to do it anyway. I thought, I've worked too hard. The time has come maybe to see if I can survive without the X-Men. So I quit X-Men and left Marvel." End quote. And that was the end of the Claremont run, the longest and possibly finest in the eyes of devotees single-author run in the history of Marvel Comics. Eventually, the drama and clash of personalities that readers knew from the books found their way into the life of the author himself. And just like that, it was all over. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the Claremont run, you can follow us on Twitter @ClaremontRun or see us on the web at www.claremontrun.com.